Hey there, team. It's Tiffany with the Intelligent Project Manager, and today we are kicking off the first section of the PMBOK 8th edition, which is the introductory section of the standard. I know everyone's excited. We're currently in a transition period before the 7th edition is phased out and the 8th edition of the exam goes underway. Before we go any further, I want to set some expectations right away. This section while it may not feel like it's very heavily tested on the exam, the reason why I want to cover this section is it helps with setting expectations and alignment for us as project managers on what the expectation is from PMI. So we spoke a little bit about the definitions found in the first section. And what I want to do is go through how PMI sets the foundation in this section for how you should think as a project manager before you ever touch a situational question. Now, here's a couple of things that I will focus on, right? A lot of you might be working professionals. You have already worked as project managers within your industry for years. That was the case for me. I worked for large companies like Union Pacific. I worked for Amazon for many years before I took my project management professional certification. What you might see in I don't want to say the real world, but what you might see within your organization, it might vary from organization to organization. But what I really like about this first section of the PMBOK 8th edition is that it sets the mental frame for how PMI defines things like value, how it defines success, and what it means when we talk about things like good judgment. So if you have already started doing practice exams and answers and things of that nature, I doubt very many people have just because this guide is still very new. I think it only shipped a few weeks back. But as you start going through the rest of the guide and as you start delving into things like exam questions, I want you to understand that if you are not seeing the expectations that you have, so for example, you take a set of exam questions and maybe you're getting some things wrong, which you feel like should be right, come back to this video and go back through that chapter. More than likely, it has everything to do with mindset, and your thought process might not necessarily align with what's being laid out in this chapter. And so that might explain the disconnect. So think of this video as just kind of like we're setting up the ways to think about this, not necessarily a content review, but with that in mind, I want to walk through how people approach this section and what some of your best practices should be as we move forward. At a high level, PMI defines management as a strategic capability. So we're no longer just a delivery function. I talked about this a little bit in a previous video, but I'm really excited about that. Projects at the fundamental level, they exist to create value by moving an organization from a current state to a future state. Yes, deliverables matter. They're never going to go away. We're always going to have something to deliver, but they are not the end goal. And I'm really glad that this is called out. At the same time, PMI is very clear. Projects do not operate in isolation, which I think is something that we've been moving to, and I'm really excited to see that as well. Every project sits inside of a broader system, and that system includes organizational governance, it includes culture, it includes portfolios, it might reside within programs, operations might be involved, and stakeholders might be involved in as well. And all of these entities and people have different definitions of value, right? And because of that reality, PMI expects us as project managers to understand the concept of balancing competing priorities. Yes, we want things to be optimized. We want to deliver the best and highest value for the customer, but we also want to make sure that it supports the organization, not just the project. And we'll talk about that when we get to things like gold plating a little bit later. So now let's think about how this mindset actually shows up on a specific exam. We haven't gotten to the exam yet, but I want to start talking through this. So instead of necessarily maybe testing this directly, I want you to think about how PMI might embed some of the language into different exam questions situationally. So certain words might show up as signals that PMI wants you to either slow down and think at a higher level or think about how this specific question might align with organizational strategy. So when you see things like value, when you see things like benefits, PMI is not asking whether or not the team completed the work. Ideally, as a project manager and as professionals who have managed projects, hopefully more often than not, you have dealt with teams that have delivered the work. I know we probably have horror stories, and I don't doubt that for a second, but they're asking whether or not the outcome justifies the investment. This is meant to shift your thinking away from just focusing on deliverables and towards focusing on impact. Answers that focus on only finishing the work or pleasing one specific stakeholder, I guarantee you that is going to miss the mark and you are going to not get the desired outcome when you go to take that exam. When you see things like governance, organizational policy, steering committee, I want you to think about the fact that PMI is probably signaling decision priority or decision authority, prioritization, and strategic alignment. In these questions, acting independently is rarely the correct answer. All right. I also want you to think about alignment as part of a formal decision making structure. So we talked about programs, portfolios, and how projects feed into that. Think about that when you see these types of questions in the future. When a question references strategic objectives or the business case in some instances, right? PMI is trying to check and understand whether or not you can connect project decision points back to organizational goals, right? It's all an interconnected system. And the right answer usually protects alignment, even if it might slow things down. It you really want to make sure that you understand the fact that you are now a change agent that creates value within your organization. So be cognizant of those things as you go through section one. I'm not saying that you need to memorize every single term or definition, but understands what some of how section one is laid out to help signal to you the thought processes with which PMI wants you to think, not only for the exam, right? Because the exam is also a means to an end. It means that you understand the principles to be able to correctly operate and apply this discipline to creating value to your organization. At the core, you should probably take this and internalize this because regardless of industry or organization, you need to understand that you are the change agent. You are the one responsible for taking this toolkit and applying it to whatever role, responsibility. It can be in corporate, it could be non-corporate, it could be for your nonprofit volunteering agency. Anything that you choose to apply these principles to as a project manager, that's what you need to take away as your core. So, the main things that you need to really focus on in thinking like a project manager is that you are operating within a system. You are not necessarily just an individual contributor. You are building value for your organization. So, how do you apply all of this? How do you apply all of this under time? How do you apply all of this under pressure? That exam, it feels like, I don't know if any of you all are like me. I often think that I am the worst exam taker and then end up doing really well, but it's because I take certain things away when I'm studying for exams, and I'll be happy to go through my exam process in a later video. But as you're going through section one, here's the quick mental filter that I want you to focus on during the exam. The first thing is going to be, does this option support organizational value, not just my project's value? Number two, does it respect the governance established by my organization, right? In chapter one or section one, it talks about different terms like the PMO, it talks about artifacts, it talks about how portfolios set the strategic objective and strategy for the business, how you deliver organizational value. So those are things to think about. Number three, does it consider the broader system the project operates within? So that might be the program. My project might be a part of a set of programs to help me realize specific benefits for the organization. Am I considering that? Number four might be, does it avoid unnecessary optimization? Right? So gold plating is a huge thing that sometimes comes about, or you might have the loudest stakeholder in the room. I know many of us have probably experienced this as project managers in our day to day, right? You have maybe a high level stakeholder, executive level stakeholder that comes in and says, we need this specific change for X customer. Sometimes you may have to acquiesce. Sometimes you may be able to go through the change management process, but PMI is wanting to understand, can you avoid things like gold plating or taking unilateral action outside of the context of the portfolio's strategic objectives or outside of what our governance policies and procedures might be. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, Tiffany, we don't want to become rigid in our thinking, and you're absolutely correct, right? There is Nothing is ever black and white, but for the purpose and context of this exam, I want you to understand the context by which section 1 is laid out as the foundation for moving through the rest of this guide. In this context, ideally, the goal is we are not taking unilateral action in any of our endeavors. So if you see responses like that on the exam, that should be a bit of a red flag for you. I understand that the real world or your everyday life might not necessarily intersect with every part of this guide, but remember, and I've said this in a previous video, what we might see in our everyday work life may not have just caught up with what has been established as the best practice from this body of knowledge, right? So think of this as ideally, if we were operating under standard work, we would be following universally what has been laid out in this body of knowledge. But we all know what happens when we all take things and modify them for our specific business practices. Things sometimes become a bit fragmented. Okay, so I'm not saying that these things don't happen. I just want to make sure that you're set up for success as you go through studying for your exam. Some other things I want you to consider is, does this answer support a sustainable future state? Why? Because as project managers, remember I called out, and it's noted in section 1, the goal of a project manager as change agents is we take the organization from one current state to one future state, right? So we're no longer just focused on task completion. And again, I cannot be more excited about that because it really emphasizes the value of this discipline, right? So if it doesn't, or if the ask does not support a sustainable future state, and it only focuses on, I checked off this box, again, that's a red flag. So I want you to take away, if the answer feels fast, if it feels disjointed from your strategic goals and objectives, if it feels isolated, if it feels overly decisive without alignment, more than likely that is a red flag. And PMI wants to understand that you can differentiate that within your level of thinking and reasoning and judgment to be able to be successful as a project manager, not just for this exam. Let's talk through a couple of scenarios and how you might see this play out, right? So, on the exam, you might be asked about a company. So, let's say a project is in execution, you're the project manager, and a key stakeholder approaches you with a request. So, perhaps they want an additional feature that they believe might improve the customer satisfaction index, and they ask you to implement it straight away, right? So, one, the work is not part of the approved scope, but it sounds reasonable. And your project team perhaps confirms that it's technically feasible, it's doable, right? It's not going to add a whole bunch to your project. Now, as project managers, I know that you all want the best for your customer. The tempting response might be to agree to the change as requested by that stakeholder because you might feel that you are being responsive to the benefit of the customer. So maybe you select an answer that reflects that, right? Just implement the change. In your current company or your job, that might be what's rewarded currently, right? Because most often businesses say, hey, the customer is always right. Let's put the customer first. But this is where PMI wants you to pause. On the exam, PMI does not treat value as a personal judgment that's driven by a single stakeholder's demand or a single stakeholder's opinion. And that's where you can get into trouble if you're not attuned to what's being laid out in section 1. Value is defined through the business case, the strategic objectives, the governance structures, and the prioritization efforts that got this project approved all the way from the portfolio level down to the program level, down to the project level in the first place, right? So instead of immediately committing to an ask, the PMI aligned response is to take a step back, assess whether or not that request aligns with the organizational objectives or our business strategy. And then now we can then have the discussion of whether or not we then need to put in some kind of formal change request to make sure that we deliver that benefit. But the key point here is we want to make sure that we protect alignment before we start focusing on adding additional value, right? So now we're over engineering a solution. We are potentially putting our organization at risk. We are potentially using more resources than were determined for this project within this program, within this portfolio, right? And so now we can put other objectives, other strategic programs, other parts of the portfolio at risk because we are taking something away in order to add value that was not necessarily asked for. So I say this all to say the PMI aligned response is to pause, evaluate the impact to scope, think about the risk, and then if we deem that there is some true benefit to this that is aligned to our organizational strategy, now we can perhaps move that change through the proper change request or governance process in order to deliver that value, right? So things might seem tempting and they might be worded in a way that seems like it's the obvious choice, but anytime you think about this, if it's truly valuable, let's make sure that we are properly aligned, right? So if we are putting forth a change that is not protecting our business, that is not protecting our strategic goals and objectives, now we are falling into a trap. And as we go through these scenarios, you'll find that the trap becomes a little bit easier to respond. Also, as you go through the guide, you'll find that those traps become easier to identify. But it all starts with this first section, right? And so it's easy to kind of skip past it because it seems kind of introductory, but I encourage you all to make sure that you sit with this, really understand what PMI is trying to lay out as the foundation before you move into further sections within this book. You found this helpful, please go ahead and give me a like. That's really going to help me to continue to grow and to start putting out some more content on a regular basis. I would love to hear some feedback from you guys on what you find tricky in section 1 and what we can continue to work through. And as always, if you're working your way through the PMBOK guide and you want some more focused content that really breaks down things like this, please feel free to subscribe. Continue pushing on. Be well, guys, and drive forward. Thanks for watching.